The words weren't screamed. They were spoken with the placid calm of a weather report seeping through the cracked kitchen window like the frigid Boston air. The apothecary said the tincture is untraceable. He assures me the decline will look entirely natural. My hand froze the spare key halfway to the lock of my own front door. The nor'easter that had grounded my flight from Chicago was supposed to have been a simple inconvenience, a tedious delay. Now standing on my own porch in the biting November wind, suitcase clutched in my numb fingers, I realized the storm had saved my life by delivering me to my own execution. I wasn't supposed to be home. Julian and his wife Camilla were meant to be watching the house a quiet refuge while their Beacon Hill apartment was being renovated. I had pictured them comfortable, safe within the walls. My husband Arthur and I had built a long pause followed Camilla's statement, a pocket of silence so heavy I felt it in my chest. Then my son's voice, hesitant and thin, "And you're sure there's no other way?" "Don't be sentimental." Julian, Camilla's voice sliced back, still unnervingly serene. "She's lived her life. We're just helping her to the finish line once guardianship is approved. Mr. Finch will have no choice but to release the trust. This house, the portfolio, it all becomes manageable. Manageable. The word hung in the air, a sterile clinical term for theft and murder. Ice spread from my fingertips through my veins, rooting me to the bluestone steps. Tincture. Guardianship, my own son. My Julian was a conspirator in a plot to erase me. I stood in the swirling snowflakes, staring at the familiar mahogany door, now a barrier to a home that had become a cage. If you've ever returned to a place expecting solace only to find it has morphed into landscape of your deepest nightmare, you will understand the vertigo that seized me. I forced a breath into my constricted lungs, straightened my spine, and turned the key in the lock. Then I pushed the door open. A bright, oblivious smile plastered on my face. The performance had begun the moment I stepped into the foyer, dropping my keys into the porcelain bowl. With a practiced clatter, they spun around Camilla by the kitchen island, her surprise melting into a saccharine smile. Julian, near the fireplace, stiffened his face. A canvas of poorly concealed panic. Flight got canceled. I announced, my voice a marvel of casual cheer. Surprise. Camilla rushed to embrace me, her hug feeling less like affection and more like an assessment. Her perfume was sharp, something with lavender and steel. "Eleanor, we weren't expecting you. Are you okay?" I leaned into the embrace, the scent of her betrayal making my stomach clench. "Just tired. A hot cup of tea would be lovely." She offered me a special blend. She'd bought an artisanal herbal mix for stress. The glass she handed me was warm, the liquid a pale, cloudy amber. I raised it to my lips, the faint, bitter almond scent barely perceptible beneath the chamomile. Took a small, deliberate sip, letting it coat my tongue. It tasted wrong, not spoiled, just dissonant. I smiled, the same gentle, trusting smile I'd given Julian his entire life, even after his father passed and a hard, opaque distance grew in his eyes. "Thank you, sweetheart. That's just what I needed." We sat together, a fractured trinity, in the warm glow of the living room. They asked polite, empty questions about my trip. I answered slowly, letting my words drift. I paused mid-sentence, feigning a lost thought, and saw their eyes meet for a fraction of a second. A quick, subtle confirmation later, after I unpacked. Camilla brought a tray with more tea and cookies to my armchair. "You should rest. Eleanor let us take care of everything." "That's very kind of you." I nodded, placing the untouched cup on the mantelpiece. As soon as she left, this was not the house. I had left, and I was no longer the woman thought they knew. I stared out at the snow-dusted street. Not in fear, but in focus. Every play has an opening night, and I had just taken my place on the stage. By morning, the house had adopted a new rhythm, one of quiet, cloying supervision. Julian left early, mumbling something about a contractor. Remained a constant smiling shadow. I moved through the kitchen with a manufactured slowness, my hands trembling just so. As I reached for the coffee filters, I let my words slur at the edges. When she stepped out to the garden to take a call, my movements became swift and precise in Arthur's old study. Slid open the bottom drawer of his mahogany desk beneath a false bottom he'd built for storing sensitive business contracts. My fingers found it, a micro recorder, no bigger than a cufflink. Arthur and I had run an antique restoration business. For 30 years, we knew the value of secrets and the art of subtlety. I pocketed the device and returned to the kitchen table. When Camilla came back inside, I looked up with a vacant expression and asked if I had taken my heart medication yet. "Yes, dear," she said, her voice dripping with condescending patience. "I gave it to you with breakfast." I nodded, my eyes drifting toward the window, as if I were losing the thread of the day itself that afternoon. I left my tablet on the hall table screen. Up, a calendar alert was set to go off. Neurology consult, Dr. Albright. I knew Camilla was a checker, a controller, while I was on the porch, ostensibly watching birds. I saw her pick it up through the reflection in the window pane. She swiped the notification away and placed the tablet back in the exact same spot. A thin, cold smile touched my lips. At dinner, I mentioned how much the dog missed Julian. Even though our beloved retriever Sam had passed away 30 years ago, Julian flinched and quickly changed the subject. Camilla watched me, her eyes narrowing with clinical assessment. That night I activated the recorder, tucking it into the silk lining of a throw pillow on my armchair. Before I pretended to doze off in front of the flickering television, thought I was asleep. "She's slipping faster than I thought," Julian whispered, his voice strained. "It's the tincture," Camilla replied. "Matter of fact, the apothecary was right. The cognitive decline is textbook. The doctor will have no choice but to back our petition. If we get the paperwork filed by Friday." Let their words settle into the hollow space in my chest. Heavy, dark, predictable. Later, in the sanctuary of my locked bedroom, I transferred the audio file to a secure USB drive. I placed it in a small fireproof box along with a sticky note on which I'd written, "Day 1 they were building their case against my sanity. I was building one against their freedom. By the end of the week, my performance had become second nature. I shuffled, I forgot names. I spoke to the barren rose bushes in the garden, as if they were old confidants. Julian and Camilla seemed placated, convinced of my rapid decline. Morning, I overheard Camilla on the phone, in the sunroom, her voice low and urgent. She mentioned a document waiting for a physician's signature, something about assessing capacity and pre-approval. I turned away, humming an old off-key melody, as I went to the kitchen to boil water for a cup of tea. No intention of drinking that night. After they were asleep, I slipped into the study. Julian's laptop was charging on the desk. I didn't touch it, but I photographed the screen with my phone. An email was open. The subject line stark and clear: Guardianship Draft Revision 2. The recipient was a lawyer. Didn't recognize the betrayal was no longer just a feeling. It was a digital artifact, time-stamped and documented when Camilla handed me a smoothie. The next morning, her new delivery method for the tincture. I looked her straight in the eye and thanked her. I sipped it without hesitation while the tiny recorder, nestled in my cardigan pocket, captured the ambient sound, the clink of her spoon, the quiet confidence in her voice, as she asked if I'd remembered to sign the new insurance forms. I needed more than their words. I needed the texture of their deception, the casual cruelty of their care. Evening, I sat in my reading chair, the fireproof box hidden beneath the cushion. My hands trembled, not from age or the tincture, but from the furious energy of the long game. I was playing my mind. Behind the mask of fog and confusion was a razor, and I was far from done. It was a quiet Sunday morning when I found Julian sitting alone on the back porch, staring into the skeletal branches of the ancient oak tree, a cup of coffee cold in his hands. He didn't look up as I slid the glass door open, just a slight, weary nod, as if he'd been expecting me. I wrapped my cashmere cardigan tighter and sat in a wicker chair opposite him. "Your father used to sit right here every morning," I began softly. "He said the sunrise over the frosted lawn was better than any headline in the paper." Julian's jaw tightened. He always had something to say. He said you had an artist's hands. I continued watching his face quiet. Strength, he called it. He always thought you'd take over the restoration business. A sharp, humorless breath escaped him. He thought I'd be a lot of things I wasn't. He never saw what I was. I let the silence hang between us. A shared space for his old wound to breathe. What do you think he missed? Gently, he finally turned to me. His eyes shadowed with a fatigue that went deeper than sleep. He didn't get me. He thought you were the sharp one. The pragmatic one. I was the one who was too sensitive, who lost things when I dropped out of business school. He didn't yell. He just looked disappointed. Was so much worse. I felt the familiar ache in his words. The shape of a hurt that had festered for years. He worried about you more than anyone. Julian, I said, my voice barely a whisper. He just didn't know how to show it. He thought if he pushed you, you might prove him wrong. That you'd become the strong man. He always struggled to be Julian. Looked away, his shoulders slumping when he died. You handled everything, the estate. The funeral, no one asked me to do a thing. I felt like a guest at my own father's memorial. The grief in his voice was stale, but still raw. You were never a guest. I corrected him. Softly, you were grieving in a way none of us knew how to reach. And maybe you still are. He didn't answer, but I saw a subtle shift in his posture. An almost imperceptible uncoiling of tension. I reached across the small table and rested my hand on his. You're not bound by the man he thought you were, Julian. It's not too late, he nodded slowly. His gaze lost in the distance for a fleeting moment. He was a boy again, lost and yearning. But as I offered this sliver of comfort, a cold awareness settled in my gut. His pain might have been the soil, but he had chosen to let Camilla plant the poison. Understanding his motive didn't excuse his actions. Compassion was not the same as permission. I pressed a kiss to his temple, a gesture that felt like a final goodbye, and went back inside behind the locked door of my bedroom. I transcribed every word of our conversation onto a fresh page in my journal. His fear, his shame, his resentment. It was all evidence now. It was just after dawn when I dialed the number I hadn't spoken to Genevieve in years. Not since we debated politics over cheap wine in our university dorm room. But her number was still in my old leather-bound address book. She was a fighter then, and she was a fighter now. The head of a non-profit dedicated to elder justice. She answered on the second ring. Genevieve, I said, my voice steady. It's Eleanor Vance. I need your help. We met at a quiet cafe in the North End. A place smelling of espresso and old wood. Genevieve arrived looking exactly as I remembered, only framed by silver hair, composed, alert, and impossible to fool. She skipped the pleasantries. Tell me everything. I slid a folder across the table. It contained photocopies of emails between Julian and an unfamiliar wealth manager. The subject line was strategic asset control. Handed her the USB drive with the audio files as she listened through a single earbud. I saw her expression harden from concern to grave resolve. Finally, I produced a small sterile vial containing the dregs of that morning's smoothie. Eleanor, she said, her voice low and firm after she'd reviewed everything, you cannot stay in that house. They are moving on you. A single misstep, a genuine moment of forgetfulness, and they will use it to strip you of everything. You're ahead of them. But not by much, I nodded, feeling a strange mix of validation and profound cold. I wasn't ready to leave. Not yet. Told her about the backup copies of everything, hidden in a safe deposit box. I told her I'd already had my medical proxy paperwork notarized and filed appointing her as my agent. She placed her hand over mine. You're doing everything right, but you need to decide on your end game before they decide it for you. We parted with a quiet hug. As I walked back to my car, the wind felt sharp but cleansing. That night I sat on the edge of my bed and reread the note I had written to myself months ago. A simple list of contacts, and a single sentence. If anything happens to me, it was not an accident. I taped note to the underside of my nightstand drawer. Just in case. The morning sun filtered through the blinds, striping the floor in bars of light and shadow. Camilla was at a yoga class. Julian was meeting with his lawyer. The house was mine in the study. I unlocked the floor safe, Hidden beneath a Persian rug, the one Arthur had installed inside was a black portfolio containing the original trust documents. Alongside it was a revised version dated 6 months prior, notarized by a traveling solicitor. Genevieve had recommended just before Arthur's health took its final turn. This version named a different executor, bypassing Julian entirely, and appointing our longtime financial advisor, Mr. Alistair Finch. I took the documents in my tote bag and drove to Mr. Finch's downtown office. He was a quiet, meticulous man who had worked with Arthur for 20 years. He greeted me with a solemn nod in a private conference room. "It's time," I said. "Simply activate the secondary clauses. Finalize the beneficiary shift. No more delays." He didn't question me. He simply pulled up the secure forms by noon. Full control of my estate. The house, the investments, the art had been transferred into an irrevocable trust managed solely by Mr. Finch and an outside legal firm. The relocation process began immediately. My son's name was now nowhere near any decision-making authority. As I left, I handed Mr. Finch another USB drive. "Insurance?" I said. He nodded and locked it in his personal safe. I returned home to the smell of roasting garlic and rosemary. Camilla was humming in the kitchen, preparing my favorite chicken dish, comfort food, her weapon of choice. When she wanted something later at the table, Julian casually brought up the idea of consolidating some household accounts for simplicity's sake. I smiled gently, excused myself to do the dishes, and felt the first hairline cracks appear in the foundation of their plan. They didn't know it yet, but the center of gravity had already shifted beneath their feet. I was no longer reacting. I was leading. By Thursday, I knew the performance had to reach its crescendo. Walked into the living room, wearing my cardigan backward, my hair a tangled mess. "I can't find my toothbrush," I said, holding up a wooden spoon with a look of utter confusion. I watered the silk orchid in the hallway. I let a pot of soup on the stove burn until the smoke alarm shrieked. Julian's frustration was palpable. Camilla's texts to him became more frequent, tiny flashes of light from across the room. They were ready that night. After I accepted my evening smoothie, I waited until they were distracted and poured it down the sink. The recorder in my pocket was on. "She thinks I'm doing her a favor with those drinks," I heard Camilla whisper to Julian in the laundry room. "The lawyer said, if she signs by Monday, it's a clean process." Just before bed, I sat on the edge of my mattress, knowing Julian was listening outside the door. I began muttering names under my breath. Nurses from Arthur's final days. Then I called out Camilla's name, but followed it with, "Is it time for my medicine?" I heard him shift in the hallway. A small final sound of confirmation. They were certain they were right. They had no idea. They were simply actors in a play, and I was the one directing the final scene. It was Tuesday morning when Julian placed the manila folder on the kitchen table. He tapped it twice. "Yeah, just some things to get in order, Mom." Inside were the documents: durable, power of attorney, financial guardianship. Request highlighted tabs indicated where I was to sign. A sticky note in his handwriting: "Lawyer needs these for final filing." This week my hands trembled, a perfectly orchestrated tremor. I took the folder to my room. Once the door was shut, my hands became still. I photographed every page. Then I sealed the originals in an envelope and hid them. I met Genevieve in her office. After hours, read the documents in silence, her jaw tight. "If you had signed these, Eleanor," she said, her voice grim, "you would have ceased to exist. Legally." The room felt impossibly cold. The next morning, Genevieve filed a formal submission with the state's Elder Protective Services. All of it. Audio files scanned. Documents. The lab report on the tincture was uploaded, under the classification of suspected financial coercion and undue influence. Meanwhile, I met with Mr. Finch. We finalized the last step. My entire estate, everything Arthur and I had ever built, was transferred into the newly established Van Initiative for Generational Trust, a charitable foundation to fund legal aid and advocacy for the elderly. That evening, a courier delivered a crisp white envelope to the house. It was a formal cease and desist warning drafted by Genevieve's legal team. It stated that the household was now being monitored, and any further attempts to pursue guardianship would be met with legal action. I placed the letter on the mantelpiece, in plain view. It was a boundary line drawn in ink. For 2 days a tense, coiled silence filled the house. I continued my act, shuffling, forgetting, letting them guide me on third night. I was folding laundry when I heard a sharp tearing sound from the living room. Then Camilla's voice, no longer calm, but high and ragged with rage. She stormed into the laundry room, waving the crumpled legal notice. "You think you're clever. You think this is going to stop us." I said nothing, just kept folding a towel, my movements slow and deliberate. Brendan followed her, his face ashen. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at me, truly looking at me, as if for the first time. The fog had lifted, but it was from his eyes, not mine. The silence stretched, until it was painful. Then he spoke, his voice cracking. "You were never going to give it to us. Not the house. Not the money. You were always going to cut us out." I finally stopped folding. I stepped toward him, my gaze unwavering. "No, Julian," I said, my voice clear and cold as a winter morning. "I never planned to cut you out. I just stopped pretending you were the kind of person I could trust." A week after they left the house, settled into a quiet I had forgotten existed. Not the silence of tension, but the deep resonant peace of a battle won. I sat on the front porch, a blanket over my shoulders, as a car pulled into the driveway. Young women law students from Boston College stepped out. They were the first interns for the Vance initiative. The lead intern handed me a folder. "Mrs. Vance," she said, her eyes bright with purpose. "Thank you for making this possible, for making room for stories like, well, for stories that need to be heard." They didn't know my story, not all of it, but they knew its legacy. Julian had believed he was playing a game of strategy for an inheritance. He never understood that the real inheritance wasn't something you take, but something you build. He had fought for a fortune he could possess, while I had quietly transformed it into a legacy that could protect. My story would not end in a quiet, medicated decline. It would not be a footnote in legal file. It would be a beginning in whispered warnings, in legal clinics, in the confident voices of these young women, and in the quiet strength of every person who refuses to have their final chapter written for them.